Please just call me Garrett. The story I'm going to share with you is a real experience I had when we went on vacation to my father's hometown. I was the one who convinced my parents to visit my grandmother. At first, Dad didn't want to go. I didn't know why, but every time I insisted, he always said it was dangerous to return to their town. He didn't want to reveal everything that had actually happened, so I was terribly confused. I really wanted to meet my grandmother, and I was also jealous of my classmates who would always go on vacation somewhere during school breaks. Come on, Dad, Mom. My friends also go on vacation in their hometowns. I want to see my grandma, I pleaded. It's scary there, son. There are many evil beings and witches, if only you knew. That's why I don't want to go back, my father said. But I didn't believe him. I knew he was just making excuses and trying to scare me so I'd stop pestering him. Unlike before, though, I was no longer swayed by fear, so I kept insisting until I finally convinced him. I was overjoyed because at last I'd get to take a real vacation too, and have something to share with the class when school started again. My grandmother lived in a rural part of Tennessee. Their local festival had just ended when we arrived. As soon as we got there, we were happily greeted by an old woman who turned out to be Grandma Gertrude, Dad's mother. She was a well-known folk healer, according to what she told me. Apparently, she was famous in her town and in neighboring villages, and people with illnesses would travel to be treated by her. I was 10 years old when my feet first touched the soil of that Tennessee countryside, but it was there that something awful would happen. Something that changed my life forever. My father died of an undiagnosed illness. When we took him to the hospital, they discovered that it looked like his intestines had rotted away. He grew weaker and weaker until he finally passed, within just 1 week of our stay there. I'll never forget that moment, because I truly blamed myself for my father's death. I regretted pushing him to go on vacation, but as the saying goes, regret is always at the end, and I could do nothing but cry over it. Grandma was also severely affected by what happened. She blamed herself because she could heal others, yet she couldn't save her own son from dying. Then suddenly, Grandma disappeared. She left without telling anyone. Mom, my younger sister Teresa, and I stayed in her house while we searched for her. After several days, we found her brooding in a little hut on her farm. She had completely abandoned her work as a folk healer and refused to treat anyone anymore. I was assigned to bring food to her each day, to that little hut where she now lived. I kept trying to convince her to come home, but she wouldn't. She just kept apologizing to me, saying it was all her fault. She suspected that maybe someone who bore a grudge against her was behind what had happened to my father. According to Grandma, it might be true that one of those people she had freed from a curse was seeking revenge, and my father got caught in the crossfire. I brought her food for several days, but as time passed, I began to worry about Grandma's condition. Whenever I came to bring her something to eat, sometimes she wouldn't recognize me. I was also growing fearful of her appearance. She no longer bathed or looked after herself. She started to resemble an old crone in a horror show, like someone who practiced dark magic. Her behavior changed too. Many times I'd catch her seeming to talk to someone, but no one was there. I felt like she had lost her mind. She would say all sorts of things I couldn't understand, and because I was just a child, I was genuinely scared of her. I begged Mom that if possible, she should be the one to bring Grandma food because I was too frightened to go near her. But one day, on my way to Grandma's hut with her meal, I came across an old man who warned me to be careful around her, that something bad was bound to happen because of the curse attached to her knowledge. When I arrived at the hut, I saw Grandma kneeling before a small altar, praying in a language I didn't recognize. I just watched her, and I noticed that the cross she was worshipping was upside down. Once she finished, I quietly entered, placed her food on the table, and walked over to the altar to straighten the inverted cross. But she saw me, and I could see intense anger on her face. She told me not to touch her things, saying that they were the only allies she had. I apologized and promised never to interfere again. She drove me away after that. The next day, when I went back to deliver her food, I found a tattooed man there. He was trying to force Grandma to sign a piece of paper he was holding. My grandmother may have been old, but she still managed to push him against the post, holding up her rickety hut. I felt sorry for her and ran to her side, hugging her. The man grew even angrier and shouted at her, "If you don't give me my wife's inheritance, you'll all bleed on this land you refuse to hand over." Then he left us. "Pick up the soil where that man stood," my grandmother told me. Obediently, I did as she asked and handed the soil to her. I watched as she took a small bottle of oil and put the soil inside, then placed it on the fire until the contents ignited and the bottle shattered. Even though I was just a kid, I already sensed it was some form of dark sorcery. Not long after Grandma did that, we heard the terrible news that the man had been attacked by a monster later that very night. His blood and entrails were said to have been scattered in the trees along the road. The entire town was terrified, and Mom, upon hearing that people were dying one after another, many of them relatives of Grandma, became afraid that she and Teresa might be next. She decided we should leave, but she suddenly fell ill. She developed a strange sickness that distorted her face, swelling her lips, and, some said, causing even worse things to emerge at nightfall. I no longer knew what to do during that time, because we didn't have enough money left to get Mom proper medical care. Nearly all the savings they'd set aside for our vacation were gone, and whatever small amount remained from the funeral was also gone. So, at a young age, I started working as an assistant for Mr. Julian, an elderly man who owned a sugarcane field. My job was to cut sugarcane stalks. Over the days I worked for him, I learned that my employer was skilled at making weapons for fighting evil creatures. One he showed me, which I particularly liked, was a pair of sticks for harness practice, carved from a type of wood called ironwood. Noticing my interest, he began teaching me how to use them. It was tough at first, but I persisted, mainly because I'd heard rumors about a monster roaming around that town, and I wanted something to help protect myself and my loved ones. Darkness fell as I headed home. I found my mother and sister asleep in their room, but I heard noises underneath the house. When I went to check, I was shocked by what I saw. Grandma was there, praying in front of what looked like another altar with an upside-down cross. It was exactly what I had seen in her hut on the farm. What was worse, I noticed several dolls there, each bearing photos of different people. One was of my father, and another had my mother's picture on it. Grandma seemed so engrossed in her prayers that she didn't notice me watching. I waited to see what she would do next. She picked up the doll with my mom's photo and blew on it. Suddenly, I heard Mom scream. I ran inside to check on her and saw a black bird perched on the window. Its eyes were red, glaring at my mother. I reacted quickly, shooing it away and throwing salt at it, making it fly off. Afterwards, I told Mom we had to leave Grandma's house right away. We should go find Mr. Julian and beg him to let us stay at his place for a while. I had no idea that we'd only be putting ourselves in more danger. On our way to Mr. Julian's, we came across a creature I never imagined could exist. A woman stood by the side of the road, as if waiting for us to pass. She wore black, and her long, tangled hair fell over her face. My mother clung to me, obviously terrified, and though Mom was weak, she still hugged Teresa close. I had no choice. I refused to let that monster harm my mother and sister. I immediately suspected it was some kind of evil being because news of attacks and killings by such creatures had been circulating around town. I pulled out the harness sticks Mr. Julian had given me and summoned my courage to face it. But what I didn't expect was that when she turned toward me, she looked human but had a goat's face, like an abomination that fed on the sick. I figured it was after my mother. It walked toward us in an eerie motion, each footstep in sync with the same arm swinging forward like a robot. Teresa screamed so loudly it almost deafened me. I braced myself for battle. It was about to lunge at us when Mr. Julian suddenly appeared, carrying another weapon for fighting monsters. I didn't know what to call it, but it looked like a whip covered in tiny thorns. The creature backed off and did not continue its attack. Mr. Julian immediately took us to his house. Overwhelmed by everything happening, I finally told Mr. Julian everything I had seen. My suspicions that Grandma Gertrude might actually be responsible for my father's death and my mother's illness, and perhaps for the deaths of other relatives too. But Mr. Julian didn't look shocked. I sensed that he already knew Grandma's true nature. I also told him about the tattooed man and the heated argument he'd had with Grandma. The old man shook his head and revealed more than I expected. Soon, people were arriving at Mr. Julian's yard, furious. They begged him to destroy the monster attacking their town. You know, I couldn't be absolutely certain Grandma was the creature they were after. What I was sure of was that she was a genuine witch, a user of dark magic who had pretended all along to be a skilled folk healer. Mr. Julian glanced at me, and I subtly shook my head. He understood right away that I wanted to keep Grandma's identity secret. When they asked him who he suspected, he said he had no idea. That left the townspeople with no choice but to talk of driving away the healers if none of them could help. "I'm not a healer," Mr. Julian declared. "I don't have the power to identify who this monster is. Why blame me?" The people quickly apologized, their anger turning into pleas. They begged Mr. Julian to help in any way he could, because the creature had killed many and strange diseases were afflicting the town. People who fell ill often became that monster's next victim. That night, my mother's face swelled even more, and she grew weaker. I was terribly afraid for what would happen to her. We were so happy just a few days earlier, excited about our vacation, but now we had only pain and misery. Mum was burning with fever, seemingly delirious, when we heard a goat-like bleating circling Mr. Julian's yard. He went outside, and I peered through the window to see him confronting that beast again. They fought, strength against strength. Multiple times it changed its form, and whenever Mr. Julian struck it with his weapon, I swore I saw my grandmother's face. I couldn't believe it. Grandma Gertrude was also some kind of evil creature that devoured the sick. No matter how powerful Grandma was, with all her dark magic, she was no match for Mr. Julian's weapon. Later on, I learned that he actually came from a long line of renowned healers and sorcerer fighters in Tennessee. He just kept his gifts hidden, preferring a quiet life. Because of the commotion, a crowd of townspeople arrived and surrounded them. I stood there, helpless, praying for good to prevail. I loved Grandma, yes, but once I realized she truly was the one devouring innocent people, I wanted her to stop her evil deeds. The people finally discovered the truth. They captured Grandma and brought her to the town square. There was nothing I or Mr. Julian could do. Everyone realized Grandma had lost her mind because of her obsession with farmland. It turned out that most of the people she had killed over the years, her own relatives, were potential heirs to the land. Many of her children, grandchildren, and even other claimants were wiped out. Dad had died, and the truth was, we hadn't even come there to claim any land. We just wanted to meet her and spend a vacation. Once at the square, a large crowd surrounded Grandma, who was firmly tied to a tree. She reverted to her human form, though many still believed she was a monster. People were angry, but strangely, some felt sympathy for her. Those who had supposedly been healed by her remedies. Yet more people despised her for the fear she had inflicted on their town. Many still couldn't believe that the kindly folk healer they knew was actually something far more sinister. Heated arguments broke out. and things went downhill fast. People started arming themselves with sharp branches and knives, and a riot erupted. Mr. Julian pulled me away, and from where we stood, we saw Grandma just smiling, watching them fight. Many were injured and left bleeding, and some even died. Meanwhile, Grandma was still tied up, looking amused as chaos reigned. I noticed Mr. Julian quietly weeping beside me, gazing at Grandma. "Why are you crying, Mr. Julian?" I asked. I was stunned when he admitted that he was actually my real grandfather, Grandma's husband. He left her because he couldn't accept what his wife had done. It hurt him deeply that the person who killed their children and grandchildren was none other than Grandma herself, driven insane by her obsession with the land. The riot ended with one group emerging victorious. They freed Grandma from her bonds. I cried at the sight, remembering my father and my mother's suffering. Suddenly, fury and a thirst for justice took over me. I ran to a fallen man and took his blade. I rushed toward Grandma, whose ropes were being untied, fully intent on avenging my parents. But the crowd realized my plan and blocked me. Mr. Julian whisked me away and brought me back to his home. When we arrived, I witnessed the most painful scene of my life. Mom and Teresa lay on the floor, drenched in their own blood. Mr. Julian and I guessed immediately who might have done it, though it couldn't have been Grandma this time. She was still at the square with us, and news soon arrived that her body had been found inside her own home the next day. An eyewitness came forward, saying they saw my Uncle Nate enter Grandma's house. Possibly he had found out she was behind the deaths of his wife and grandchildren, so he sought revenge, killing my mother and sister instead. Maybe he'd expected to find Mr. Julian there too, to take him out as well. Since Mr. Julian wasn't home, he ended up killing my mother and sister. After that, it appeared he went after Grandma. It was a massacre in that town, later explained away as a land dispute in the official reports. Because I was so young, Grandpa Julian asked me to go with him, promising he'd take care of my needs, since we two were the only family left. He took me away from Tennessee, worrying that my uncle might hunt us down. The authorities never did catch up with Uncle Nate, and he remained a wanted man. Until now, Uncle Chris, I still think about my mistakes, how I should have listened to my father. If I had, maybe no one would have gotten hurt. Maybe they wouldn't have died, and I wouldn't have endured such a bloody vacation in that town in Tennessee. That's the end of my story. Thank you so much to everyone who listened and read through all of it. Just call me Alfred. The story I'm going to share now is about something that's based on the true experience of my uncle when he took a vacation in Ohio. It's a story I'm sure will give you chills. The story I'm telling is one of my uncle's accounts, something that keeps coming back to my mind, even though I try to forget the hair-raising incident in Uncle Mark's story. When the bus wheels finally touched Ohio, Uncle Mark was overjoyed. He hadn't really expected this dream vacation of his to push through, so he was very lucky that his boss let him have the time off. He was excited to see his parents and relatives in Maplewood. While the bus he was riding passed along the highway, a woman waved it down. The bus pulled over and let the woman board. Once she was inside, a revolting stench spread through the air, like rotting meat or a dead animal. Everyone guessed the smell must have been coming from the basket she was carrying. All the passengers endured it, covering their noses. Nobody wanted to get close to the woman because her hair was matted, her nails were long, and her eyes glowed red with a fierce look. Her clothes were also in tatters. She sat at the back of the bus, and the people near her were forced to stand. As the bus moved, the woman just sat there blankly, and threads of drool trickled from her trembling lips. Watching her, Uncle Mark felt a mixture of pity and fear. However, he decided to ignore her, choosing instead to look out the window. The view was wonderful, and it became even more beautiful because the sun was now beginning to set in the west. After a while, the bus stopped in a rural part of Ohio, a place that was unfamiliar to Uncle Mark. The conductor announced that they had arrived in Maplewood, the community where Uncle Mark's parents lived. Uncle Mark's face lit up with excitement as he got off the bus. Right behind him, that strange woman also got off. Then the bus sped away, almost as if the driver was terrified of the spot where Uncle Mark got out. "What's his deal?" Uncle Mark muttered, wondering as he watched the bus roar away. Then Uncle Mark surveyed the place around him and was surprised by how much it had changed. He no longer recognized the roads because the area had grown thick with trees. Gone were the houses that used to stand close together. He grabbed his cell phone to figure out exactly where the bus had dropped him off, planning to call or text his relatives, but there was no signal there. Uncle Mark simply wiped the sweat off his forehead because he had no idea which way to go to reach his family's home. He thought to himself, if this really is Maplewood, how did all these years go by and the place still ended up so remote? It's even more isolated now, with fewer and fewer homes. Uncle Mark decided to ask the woman for directions. He feared she might not respond, but she suddenly spoke. He was glad she could still speak, and he was pleased because at least now he had someone to ask for the correct route to Maplewood. But when he questioned her, she told him he was already in Maplewood, that the land they stood on was indeed part of Maplewood. She pointed out a path that supposedly led to where there were more houses. Uncle Mark felt confused. The path looked very narrow and overgrown by plants. Still, eager to get home to his family, he decided to head down that route. He just kept walking and walking until darkness overtook him on the path. Evening was closing in, and he still couldn't see any houses. The woman stayed behind him the whole time, and Uncle Mark couldn't help glancing back now and then because of the stench coming from her basket. Uncle Mark took out his cell phone and turned on his flashlight. Everything was fine at first, but suddenly Uncle Mark felt a chill when the woman vanished from behind him. He wondered where she'd gone, but he convinced himself maybe she had taken some other path since she was local to the area and would know its twists and turns. Uncle Mark let it go and decided to keep walking forward. Eventually, after a long time, Uncle Mark noticed small lights not far in the distance, lights coming from homes he could see. It was as if a thorn was pulled from his side once he realized there were indeed people in the place he'd stumbled upon. However, he hesitated to go all the way there because the houses looked strange, nothing like the Maplewood homes he remembered. Their materials seemed weak, and even at night, Uncle Mark could see enough of the surroundings by the moonlight and a few dim lights from the houses themselves. He wondered if that was really where his parents and other relatives lived. He was convinced that his family's house should already have been made of sturdier materials since he'd been sending money for years to help renovate their home. He used to wire them funds every month back when he was working in Chicago. He was about to retrace his steps, sure that he had landed in the wrong village, but when he turned around, his flashlight fell on that woman he'd ridden with on the bus. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I was thinking of heading back. I think I got off at the wrong stop," Uncle Mark answered, but the woman stopped him from leaving. She pointed out it was already late, and something bad might happen to Uncle Mark on the road. She said there were many wild animals roaming around once the darkness set in, so she invited him to spend the night at her home. Uncle Mark, feeling muddled by fatigue, did not think clearly and quickly accepted her offer. The woman smiled at him, then started walking toward her house, while Uncle Mark trailed behind, observing the people around them. He felt unsettled by how they reacted to his presence. As soon as he showed up, doors and windows all over the village swung open, and everyone seemed to be peering at him. Scores of children peered through their windows, and some couples stood at their front doors. Their stares were intense and hostile, like fierce lions looking to devour a smaller creature. "Just let them be," "They're always like that here in our tribe whenever a stranger comes," the woman said. That gave Uncle Mark goosebumps, because in all his life, he had never witnessed such bizarre people. By the time the two of them got to her house, she invited him inside. She lit a lantern and invited him to sit down. She set her basket on the table, and the stench in that house was overwhelming. Uncle Mark might have preferred to step back outside, but he was more afraid of the people milling about. The woman asked him to eat, but Uncle Mark declined because he'd lost all appetite, thanks to the foul odor inside that house. Feeling awkward about complaining, he was a mere guest. He just covered his nose so he wouldn't throw up. Once the woman finished her meal, she showed Uncle Mark a small cot where he could sleep. Before resting, the old woman started chatting with him. To Uncle Mark's surprise, she asked him point blank if he was still a virgin. Without hesitation, he answered that he was, explaining he had never had a girlfriend. The old woman smirked. Her face revealed a kind of excitement upon hearing Uncle Mark's answer. In his thoughts, he wondered why she was asking about his virginity, but he brushed it aside. After they finished talking, the old woman went into her tiny bedroom, while Uncle Mark stayed out on the cot in the main room. He couldn't sleep because every time he shut his eyes, his imagination flooded with disturbing images. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of him, and he drifted off. But in the middle of the night, he felt something sharp poking into his stomach. He bolted upright, only to find nobody next to him. Nobody was around, and there was no one to poke him in the stomach. Uncle Mark supposed it must have been hunger pangs from missing dinner, so he tried lying back down to sleep. But whenever he was about to drift off, he kept feeling heavy hands touching his body. He got up again, thinking he'd check on the older woman in her bedroom, but she was gone, nowhere to be found. He noticed her bedroom window was open, so he climbed up to it, figuring he might see her outside. A moment later, peering out, Uncle Mark saw the old woman talking to a black dog, apparently from a neighbor's home. He was perplexed. Why was she talking to a dog at this late hour? Moreover, why would she choose to leave through the window instead of the door? But seeing that nothing else was happening, Uncle Mark returned to his cot and tried to sleep again. Eventually, though, he woke up once more to the sound of scuffling outside the hut and faint growling noises that made his heartbeat soar. Anxiety gripped him, and he realized it sounded like dogs fighting one another outside. Worried, Uncle Mark looked for the old woman inside the hut, but couldn't find her. He decided to lock all the windows. He searched for any kind of weapon, maybe a knife, but found nothing. Then he heard something thud on the roof, and all around the hut he heard barks and howls from dogs that sounded as if they had gone mad. It was as if they were surrounding Uncle Mark, trying to get at him. At that moment, he was struck with the sudden, terrifying notion that the tribe he had stumbled into was not an ordinary group of people, but rather a clan of ghouls. His fatigue disappeared, replaced by a single thought: how could he possibly escape or flee from that place? To his horror, some of the dogs tore a hole in the hut's flimsy woven walls. Large black dogs burst inside, and several of them transformed into people, though not fully human, with faces resembling ravenous beasts. Uncle Mark confirmed that these were indeed shapeshifters, Aswang. Panicked, he looked around for the older woman who owned the hut. At that moment, another black dog transformed, taking the exact form of the older woman who had offered Uncle Mark shelter. He realized she, too, was one of them. Terrified, Uncle Mark backed away, every fiber of his body trembling. One of the dogs lunged for him, ready to rip him apart, but the older woman held it back. She announced that they needed Uncle Mark for a coming festival. They planned to use him as a sacrifice because he was still a virgin. It was then that Uncle Mark understood why she had been so curious about whether he was still a virgin. They needed an untouched man to sacrifice at their upcoming feast. Uncle Mark thrashed and managed to slip out of the Aswang's grip, running into a small room in the hut. He planned to leap out the window, but when he looked, he saw more Aswang waiting outside. Taking a risk, he jumped anyway. Upon hitting the ground, he was immediately surrounded by the Aswang who had been waiting, and he realized he had no choice but to give up. They bound him to a huge tree. A crowd of them circled him. Some wanted to tear into him at once, but the others stopped them, explaining that his body needed to be saved for their upcoming festival in 2 days. They would only kill him then. Morning came, and Uncle Mark was still tied to the large tree. He felt hungry and dehydrated, so he complained to the old woman. She went into her hut and came back with the same foul-smelling basket. She took out a rotting liver and a bottle of dark blood. She forced Uncle Mark to drink the blood from the bottle. Uncle Mark clamped his mouth shut, spilling blood on the ground. Furious, the older woman clawed him across the stomach, shredding his shirt and leaving scratch marks on his skin. She then grabbed the rancid liver and tried to stuff it into his mouth. Uncle Mark refused to open up, as he couldn't bring himself to eat such a thing. He'd rather starve than consume a rotting organ. Incensed, the old woman just smeared the liver all over Uncle Mark's face. Night fell again, and the Aswang brought in a new captive, tying him to the backside of the same tree Uncle Mark was bound to. At that point, Uncle Mark had almost lost all hope of leaving that place alive. He kept struggling against the ropes, which gradually loosened. He couldn't run yet because an Aswang was watching him. Stealthily, he reached for the knot binding the other captive behind him. Once Uncle Mark loosened it, the man bolted away, despite the many Aswang who saw him flee. So desperate was that man to escape this tribe of monsters that he simply ran. But the Aswang noticed him and chased him down. Though he made it a good distance, he couldn't outrun them. He begged for mercy, but they ignored him. One of the Aswang reached from behind and tore his heart out. The man died instantly. Then the Aswang pounced on his remains, some of them morphing into dogs while fighting over his body, which was eventually torn into pieces. Almost nothing of him was left, aside from the blood staining the grass. Uncle Mark gagged at the sight of such a gruesome event. He couldn't stomach the horrifying end of that man, who had tried to flee. Fear consumed him, and he dreaded that he might meet the same fate. He decided to wait for a perfect opening to escape, though it was hard because someone's gaze was almost always locked on him. Morning arrived once again, and Uncle Mark was still tied to that tree. He saw a machete lying not too far away. Looking around and seeing that no Aswang were paying close attention at that moment, most were busy with their everyday chores, he gradually loosened the rope around himself. During the daytime, these creatures seemed to behave more like normal people, going outside under the sun, which made Uncle Mark's plan a bit simpler. Quietly, he made his way toward the machete, grabbed it, then returned to the tree and retied himself loosely with the rope, hiding the machete at his side. Armed with that machete, Uncle Mark felt a glimmer of hope. That day was the scheduled feast for these Aswang, the very day they intended to kill him. Uncle Mark knew he had limited time. He couldn't easily slip away in broad daylight because these monsters, while in their human form, still roamed around the village. As he watched them, they busied themselves with preparations for the festival, decorating the area where Uncle Mark would be sacrificed. They slaughtered animals, put up decorations, and made all sorts of arrangements. Because they were occupied, Uncle Mark seized the chance to get away. He was about to leave when the older woman, who had first lured him, caught sight of him and came striding over, her face twisted in anger. As she neared, Uncle Mark covertly gripped his machete and pressed its tip against the woman's throat, letting the other Aswang see it. Terrified for her safety, the others surrounded them. "If you don't let me go, I'll kill her," Uncle Mark shouted, voice shaking. He seized the old woman by both arms, the blade still pressed to her neck. At that moment, none of the aswang transformed, likely because it was still daytime. They gave Uncle Mark space to pass, not wanting to lose one of their own. Uncle Mark held on to the old woman as a hostage while they walked away from the tribe. No one followed, likely for fear that she'd be killed. By the time they were some distance away, Uncle Mark realized he had no clue how to leave the forest. He forced the old woman to go first, warning that if she tried to trick him, she'd die. She complied, but deliberately led him around in circles. Noon came, but they still hadn't emerged from the forest. Uncle Mark didn't realize she was doing it on purpose to stop him from escaping. Enraged, he pressed the machete deeper into her neck, drawing a bit of blood. "If you don't show me the right path, you won't make it to sundown," Uncle Mark said. The old woman resumed walking and promised to show him the correct way. But, as before, she continued leading him around in circles. When late afternoon came, Uncle Mark knew he was being toyed with. In a blind rage, he stabbed her in the neck, mercilessly hacking at her until she died. Before long, night was closing in. Uncle Mark hurried in whatever direction he could, but he still couldn't find a way out. He kept ending up in the same places. It seemed the old woman's trick had worked, and he was now lost for good. Eventually, night enveloped the forest completely. A cold dread wrapped around Uncle Mark, because the darkness was absolute, though the bright moon helped him see a little. Without that moonlight, he'd have been unable to proceed. He sensed the aswang converging on his position. Determined, he steeled himself for what was coming. He was surprisingly unafraid now, as if his harrowing experiences had hardened him. One of the aswang leapt at him, but Uncle Mark met it with a swing of the machete. Even though the aswang was strong, Uncle Mark refused to give in, fueled by sheer terror and grit. He sustained injuries and cuts, but managed to bring down any aswang that attacked. Finally, the leader of the clan emerged and attacked more strategically, cautious not to kill Uncle Mark outright because he was meant to be sacrificed back in the village. In the confusion, the leader managed to scratch Uncle Mark with its nails. Excited by the taste of his blood, the aswang licked it off, red eyes blazing with renewed violence upon realizing that Uncle Mark was not actually a virgin after all. Uncle Mark had lied. He'd had plenty of girlfriends back in Chicago. Furious, several aswang charged him all at once, intent on killing him since the reason for sparing his life was gone. All Uncle Mark could do was keep running. He only stopped to fight when an aswang got close enough. Bleeding and growing weaker from the constant battles, Uncle Mark suddenly glimpsed a paved road. There, he spotted a motorcycle lying on its side, presumably belonging to some previous victim. He tried starting the bike, and to his relief, it roared to life. Wasting no time, he accelerated and tore away from that place. When he saw a police station, he immediately stopped and reported what had happened. But the officers just laughed, thinking he was out of his mind. In the end, they dropped him off at the real Maplewood where his relatives lived. Though the police didn't believe his story, Uncle Mark was grateful he had escaped what he'd once thought was certain doom. That's where my story ends. Thank you all very much for listening. This was Mr. Horror. See you soon.